does
Captain,
not forgive.
the shields are
It
collapsing!
does not remember mercy.
Bypass
And
the
it does
main
not
relays
care
and
what
power
world
them up!
burns beneath its churning tides. Only that something always burns. For 10,000 years, the astropathic choirs of the Imperium have screamed themselves hoarse, trying to map its currents. And for 10,000 years, the warp has answered with silence, madness, or worse. But on the frontier world of Caldris Secundus, in the bleeding dark of the 42nd millennium, something answered back that had never been heard in this galaxy before. Not the shriek of a demon, not the whisper of a chaos god, but the cold, alien hunger of a hive mind that did not belong here at all. No astropathic choir foresaw it. No augur registered a warp signature worth flagging before it was already too late. The sky above Caldris Secundus simply tore, a wound of violet lightning splitting the heavens from horizon to horizon. And from that wound fell 3 armies that had never once, in all their history, shared the same sky. The story is told in third person, moving between factions, as the galaxy itself must learn to move between them, because no single perspective could contain what happened next. Sarah Kerrigan felt the tear before she saw it. One moment the Hyperion's bridge crew was monitoring a routine long-range jump between Dominion systems. The next, every screen aboard the battlecruiser dissolved into static, and Kerrigan, no longer the queen of blades and body, but never entirely free of what she had been, felt something vast and violent claw at the edges of her mind. It was not Zerg. It was not Protoss. It was not anything she recognized, and that alone told her how much danger they were in. Jim. Her voice was steady, the way it always was when the world was ending. Something's wrong. Jim Raynor didn't need to ask what. He'd flown with Kerrigan long enough to know that when her voice dropped that low and that calm was the last thing anyone should be feeling. He grabbed the console as the Hyperion shuddered, the deck plating groaning under stresses no engineer had designed for. Outside the viewport, the stars themselves seemed to smear, streaking into ribbons of light that didn't belong to any hyperspace corridor the Dominion had ever charted. Systems are dead, Matt Horner called from Ops, fighting his own console for control that wasn't there anymore. Navigation's gone, we've lost the fleet net. Then the light took them. Nearly 400 kilometers away, aboard the Spear of Aden, Hierarch Artanis felt the disturbance differently, not as violence, but as a wrongness in the Kala itself. A dissonance rippling through the psionic matrix that bound his people together. The Nerazim among his warriors felt it too, and for once Templar and Dark Templar alike went still with the same instinctive unease. Something was pulling at the fabric between minds, something hungry and vast, and it tasted nothing like the void. Hierarch. Vorazin's voice was sharp, even filtered through the ship's comm. The Kala is bleeding. I feel it, Artani said. He had faced the death of a Zelnaga, the fall of Ire, the long grief of a people scattered across the stars. And still, this new sensation crawled beneath his skin like nothing he had known before. Brace the fleet. Whatever this is, we are not prepared for it. They were not wrong to be afraid. When the light faded and the warp's violet wound sealed itself shut behind them with a sound like a scream cut off mid-breath, 3 fleets found themselves scattered across the ash-choked skies of Caldris Secundus, a forge world on the ragged edge of imperial space, half consumed by industrial sprawl and half by radioactive wasteland, its skies thick with promethium smog and its population thin with the exhaustion of a war that had never truly ended. It was, by grim coincidence, a war the Imperium was already losing. Caldris Secundus sat on the crumbling frontier of a sector locked in a decade-long grind against the encroaching dark. Orc raiders to the core ward flank, whispered rumors of chaos incursions along the rift's jagged edge, and worst of all, the first confirmed sightings of Tyranid bioships drifting in system just 3 months prior. The garrison here was thin, its Astra Militarum regiments bled dry by attrition, and the single Space Marine chapter overseeing the sector, the Iron Sentinels, a stern and unforgiving successor chapter descended from the Iron Hand's unbending doctrine, had grown paranoid to the point of lethality. They had seen too many false alarms turn real. They had lost too many brothers to Xenos who wore friendly faces first. So when Dominion dropships, Zerg biosignatures, and Protoss warp signatures all bloomed across their augur arrays within the same 10-minute window, The Iron Sentinels did not hesitate. They did not debate. They opened fire. The first shots took a squad of Dominion Marines completely by surprise. A hail of mass-reactive bolter rounds tearing through the perimeter of a scouting party barely 20 minutes planetside. Men who had survived the Second Great War against the Zerg, now dying in a war they didn't know had started. Sergeant Hendricks went down screaming before he even saw who was shooting. Overhead, a swarm of newly hatched mutalisks, disoriented, still adapting to the planet's thick atmosphere, banked hard as ground-based flak batteries opened up, mistaking the creatures for tyrannid gargoyles. One mutalisk shrieked and spiraled into a promethium refinery, the resulting explosion painting the smog-choked sky orange. Kerrigan felt every one of those deaths as a spike of psionic feedback, 1,000 small screams threading through her mind at once. She had spent years learning to control that flood, to not let it drown her. But here, in a galaxy soaked in psychic static she had never encountered before, the control felt thinner than it should have. Something about this place amplified everything, sharpened it, made the swarm's pain louder, and her own grip weaker. "They're shooting at everything that moves," Raynor snarled, watching the tactical display fill with hostile contacts. Human contacts. "This isn't first contact. This is a massacre in progress." "Belay retaliation," Kerrigan said, and the order cost her something to give. Every instinct she'd built across 2 lifetimes screamed to answer force, with overwhelming force. But this was not the swarm's galaxy, and she did not yet know what she was dealing with. "We pull back. We find out who's shooting before we decide who's the enemy." It was, Raynor would later reflect, the first of many decisions that would define exactly how uneasy an alliance 3 warring civilizations could forge in a galaxy that had never asked for any of them. Aboard the Spear of Adden, Artanis received the reports of Dominion and Zerg casualties with grim understanding. He had seen the golden-armored warriors on the ground below, towering, disciplined, utterly merciless, and recognized in their bearing something disturbingly familiar. The rigid, uncompromising certainty of a people who believed themselves the only rightful defenders of their civilization. It was a certainty Artanis knew intimately. The Protoss had worn that same arrogance once, and it had cost them ire. "Do not engage unless engaged," he ordered his fleet, though his hearts ached at the cost of restraint. "We came here through no fault of our own. We will not compound that misfortune with a war we do not understand." But understanding, in this galaxy, was a currency in desperately short supply. Chapter Master Voss Thren of the Iron Sentinels stood on the command deck of his strike cruiser, watching Augur returns bloom across 3 distinct, unknown signatures, and felt nothing but the cold certainty of a man who had buried 100 brothers to Xeno's treachery. "Xenos," he said, the word flat as a death sentence. 3 separate strains, converging on a single world, at a single moment. "This is not coincidence, Chaplain. This is an invasion." "The Inquisition should be informed," his chaplain warned. "The Inquisition is 11 days away by astropathic relay," Thren said. "By the time they answer, this will already be finished, one way or another." He turned to his gathered officers, iron-masked and unflinching, and gave the only order his doctrine had ever permitted him to give in the face of the unknown. "Purge them all." If any of the newcomers to Caldrus Secundus had hoped this galaxy might offer them mercy, understanding, or even simple curiosity, that hope died in the same moment the chapter master's order rippled down through Vox channels to every Iron Sentinel on the surface. Whatever the Dominion, the Swarm, and the Dalam had crossed into, it was not a galaxy that asked questions before it opened fire. It was a galaxy that had forgotten how. If you want to see more universes collide with the 41st millennium, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a franchise you'd want to see crash into Warhammer 40K in the comments below. The order to purge did not fall as one great hammer blow. It fell in pieces, Vox bursts crackling down through a dozen different command channels, reaching different units at different times. And it was in that gap, that terrible lag between command and execution, that the true shape of the disaster on Caldrus Secundus began to reveal itself. Sergeant Aurelian Cass of the Iron Sentinels 4th Tactical Squad had not heard the order yet when his patrol crested the ridge above the Vareth Hive colony and saw, for the first time, something that should not have existed. It moved low across the cracked earth, all chitin and sinew, dozens of shapes flowing together like a single organism wearing many bodies, the unmistakable, skittering gait of creatures built for consumption. Cass had fought Tyranids twice before, on Corrida's Prime and in the ash wastes of Hive Meridian, and every instinct honed by those battles screamed the same warning now. Xenos bioform multiple contacts, moving to flank, he voxed, raising his bolter. Brothers form on me. What Cass did not know, could not know, with no frame of reference for a galaxy he'd never heard of, was that the creatures below him were not Tyranids at all, but a scouting brood of Zerg hydralisks, dispatched by instinct alone to assess the terrain and the strange new biomass signatures bleeding across their perception. They moved the way the swarm always moved, efficient, purposeful, curious in the narrow, predatory way that all Zerg were curious about anything that might be food, threat, or both. The lead hydralisk caught the acrid tang of promethium exhaust and unfamiliar biological matter on the wind and slowed, its serpentine head swaying as it parsed the sensation. It had never smelled anything like space marine gene seed before. Nothing in the swarm's genetic memory, vast and ancient as it was, had a category for ceramite, for sanctified oaths, for warriors bred across 10,000 years to be the Emperor's unrelenting fist. It did not matter. Sergeant Cass's bolter spoke first. The round took the lead hydralisk through its exposed throat sac, and the explosion of alien blood and shrapnel triggered every defensive instinct the brood possessed. What might have been, in another circumstance, a cautious retreat became instead a screaming, chittering charge, because the swarm did not know how to negotiate, only to adapt, and its adaptation to gunfire was simple. Close the distance, and kill whatever was killing you. 3 hydralisks died in the first exchange, torn apart by mass-reactive bolter rounds that shredded chitin as easily as flesh. But Zerg biology had never been designed for restraint, and the survivors surged forward with a speed that caught even battle-hardened Astartes off guard. Brother Yorin took a needle-spine volley across his chest plate hard enough to crack ceramite, staggering back with a grunt of pain that would have killed an ordinary man outright. Fall back to the ridge line. Cass bellowed, though retreat was not a word his chapter used easily. Regroup and hold. It was, in the grand and terrible ledger of the galaxy's history, an utterly unremarkable skirmish. 3 dead Xenos, 1 wounded Astartes, a brief and bloody exchange on a nowhere ridge above a nowhere hive colony. But it was also the first time in recorded Imperial history that Zerg and Space Marine blood had ever mixed in the same soil, and neither side understood yet what that meant. For kilometers to the south, Jim Raynor was receiving the reports in fragments, patched together from Dominion scanners, still struggling to parse the tactical chaos of an unfamiliar war zone. "We've got contact reports from the Eastern Brood Cluster," he said, jaw tight. "Hydralisks are engaging something heavily armored. Not Tyranid. The biosigns don't match anything in the swarm's threat catalog." "Recall the brood," Kerrigan said. She stood at the Hyperion's forward viewport, watching distant flashes of promethium fire bloom against the smog-dark horizon, and felt the deaths of her hydralisks the way she always felt Zerg deaths, as a subtraction cold and immediate, from some vast internal ledger she could never stop keeping. "I don't want a war we didn't choose." "Little late for that," Raynor said, not unkindly. "Whoever's shooting back sure didn't ask for a diplomatic exchange first." Kerrigan's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did, a stillness that Raynor had learned, across years of fighting beside her, meant she was choosing her next words with unusual care. "Then we make them ask," she said. "I want a channel open. Whatever they are, they're organized enough to coordinate defensive fire in under a minute. That's not mindless. That's discipline." It was the first correct assessment anyone would make about the Adeptus Astartes that day, and it would matter more than Kerrigan yet knew. Above the atmosphere, aboard the Spear of Adden, Artanis watched the unfolding chaos through the Dalam's own sensor arrays and felt the weight of an old, familiar grief settle over him. He had hoped, foolishly, he now realized, that the Protoss might have more time to observe before violence found them. That hope had lasted less than 2 hours. Send a scouting phase detachment to the conflict zone, he ordered. Zealots only, minimal engagement. I want to understand what we are dealing with before we commit to any judgment. Executor Solendes, ever pragmatic, voiced the concern already forming in Artanis' own mind. Hierarch, if these golden warriors fight the Zerg with such ferocity, they may show us no more mercy. Our philosophy separates us from a swarm, but will they see that distinction, or only more Xenos to purge? I do not know, Artanis admitted, but if we do not attempt to be understood, we guarantee only that we never will be. The Zealot detachment descended in shimmering columns of psionic light, materializing at the edge of the conflict zone with a grace that startled even the battle-hardened Astartes, still holding the ridge line above Vareth Hive Colony. Sergeant Cass turned his bolter toward the new arrivals on reflex. 3 more Xeno strains in a single afternoon was beyond coincidence, beyond anything his training had prepared him to process calmly. But the Protoss warriors made no aggressive move. They simply stood, weapons lowered, psi blades dormant, watching. It was Brother Yorin, still bleeding from his cracked chest plate, who broke the silence first. They're not attacking, he said, disbelief thick in his voice. They're Xenos, Cass snapped, though his finger hadn't yet tightened on the trigger. That is all the information required. But it was not, in fact, all the information the moment offered. And even Cass, iron-hearted, doctrine-bound, shaped by a chapter that trusted nothing born outside humanity, felt the smallest, most dangerous seed of hesitation take root as he stared at warriors who had every opportunity to kill him and chose, instead, only to watch. That hesitation would not survive contact with Chapter Master Thren's absolute orders. But for one suspended moment on a smog-choked ridge above a dying hive world, 3 galaxies held their breath together, and no one fired. It would not last. Within the hour, Vox traffic across the Iron Sentinel's command net carried Thren's unambiguous decree down to every squad on the surface. Purge them all, and Sergeant Cass, whatever doubt had flickered through him, was a soldier of the Emperor first, and a thinking man second. He raised his bolter toward the silent Protoss line. Fire, he said, and hated, in some small and unexamined corner of himself, that he did. If you want to see more universes collide with the 41st millennium, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a franchise you'd want to see crash into Warhammer 40K in the comments below. Bolter fire tore into the Protoss line before Executor Solendes' warriors could fully react. And for the first time since the fall of Ire, the Dalam found themselves attacked not by Zerg brood or Terran opportunists, but by something entirely new, disciplined, armored, merciless in a way that reminded Solendes, uncomfortably, of the Protoss' own Templar at their most zealous. Psionic shields flared to catch the incoming rounds, blue-white energy rippling under the impact of mass-reactive shells designed to punch through tank plating. 2 zealots staggered, but held. A third, caught at an angle his shield hadn't fully covered, took a round through the shoulder joint, and went down with a cry that echoed strangely across the ash flats. Pain expressed in a language the Iron Sentinels had never heard, but understood instantly all the same. Hold position, Solendes ordered through gritted teeth, her twin blades still dormant at her sides. Do not return fire. We came to observe, not to. A second volley answered before she could finish, and this time a zealot's shield failed entirely. He crumpled, ceramic plating and psionic armor alike unable to stop what followed. Solendes felt the death ripple through the Kala like a struck bell, and something in her ancient, disciplined heart cracked open just wide enough for grief to become fury. Enough, she said, and her blades ignited. What followed was not a battle so much as a brief, brutal correction. The zealot's psi blades moving with a speed and precision that even Astartes' reflexes struggled to track, deflecting incoming rounds that could be deflected, weathering those that couldn't. But Solendes had given the order to defend, not to slaughter, and her warriors showed a restraint that would have seemed impossible to any observer who did not understand Protoss discipline. They disabled weapons, shattered ceramite plating at the joints, drove attacking Astartes back, and killed only when there was no other choice. Sergeant Cass found this out personally when a zealot's blade came for his throat and stopped, at the last possible instant, a hair's breadth from his gorget. You do not have to die today, the zealot said, voice resonant with something between contempt and pity. Choose whether that changes anything. Cass did not lower his weapon, but he did not raise it again either, not immediately. And in the ringing silence that followed, 3 of his brothers wounded, none dead, the Xenos withdrawing rather than pressing their advantage. Something in his certainty wavered for the second time that day. It would not matter. Chapter Master Voss Thren received the reports of the engagement with the particular, grinding fury of a man who had already made up his mind and found the universe insufficiently cooperative in confirming it. They showed restraint, Thren repeated, standing before his assembled command staff in the strategium of his strike cruiser, the Iron Vigil. Sergeant Cass reports the Xenos had the opportunity to kill our brothers and chose not to. Some of you will hear that and call it evidence of honor. No one spoke. Thren's gaze swept the chamber like a blade looking for purchase. I call it evidence of patience, he said. Xenos who wish to study us before they consume us. This is not the first time such a strategy has been used against the Imperium, and it will not be the last. We do not reward patience with hesitation. Chaplain Auric Voss, no relation to the chapter master by blood, though the shared name had caused more than one administrative headache over the decades, stepped forward with the careful deference of a man who had earned the right to disagree and knew exactly how far that right extended. Chapter Master, 3 separate Xenos strains, none matching any recorded pattern, arriving within the same hour, on the same world, and yet fighting neither each other nor in obvious coordination. That is not consistent with any known invasion doctrine. Then it is a doctrine we have not yet catalogued, Thren said, which makes it more dangerous, Chaplain, not less. Or, Voss pressed, it suggests these are not, in fact, a single coordinated threat. The Inquisition would want to know the difference before we commit the chapter to total war against 3 unknown quantities simultaneously. It was the first crack in the rune's unity, and it did not go unnoticed. Captain Ferris Adamant, commander of the 2nd Company and a veteran of the sector's grinding war against the Orc clans, folded his arms and offered the quiet, dangerous observation that would define the chapter's fracture for the remainder of the campaign. The chaplain isn't wrong to ask the question, Adamant said, but he isn't in command of this sector. Voss Thren is, and I have followed the chapter master through worse odds than this. This is not about the chain of command, Voss said. This is about whether we spend the lives of our brothers on a war we do not understand, against enemies who, by every report reaching this chamber, have shown more restraint toward us than we have shown toward them. Thren's expression did not change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop regardless. You would have me negotiate with Xenos, Chaplain. I would have you gather intelligence before you condemn every soul on this world to a 3-front war, Voss said. That is not mercy. That is prudence. For a long moment, Thren said nothing. Then he turned to the tactical hololith at the chamber center, where 3 distinct clusters of hostile contacts, Terran, Zerg, Protoss, though the Iron Sentinels had names for none of them yet, glowed in cold blue light across the ash wastes of Caldris Secundus. Prudence, Thren said slowly, is a luxury purchased with time we do not have. The Tyranid Splinter Fleet, detected 3 months ago, has not withdrawn from this system. It has gone quiet, and I have learned across 4 decades of war that a quiet Tyranid fleet is not a retreating one. It is a fleet that has found something worth waiting for. He gestured at the hololith, at the tangled, overlapping contact clusters. Perhaps it has found that something today. The implication settled over the chamber like a shroud. If the chapter master was right, if the arrival of 3 unknown Xenos forces was in any way connected to or simply convenient for a Tyranid fleet already lurking at the system's edge, then Thren's judgment was not paranoia. It was the only sane response available. Then I ask again, Voss said quietly, that we determine whether these newcomers are allies of the Tyranids or their prey. Because I do not believe, Chapter Master, that anything born of the great devourer would show mercy to a wounded enemy on the battlefield. And Sergeant Cass reports that is precisely what happened today. It was a fair point and a dangerous one, because it meant Thren's own doctrine, purge first, question never, might be manufacturing the very war it claimed only to prevent. But Voss Thren had not risen to chapter master by permitting doubt to slow the Iron Sentinel's hammer, and he was not inclined to start now. "We will proceed with full engagement protocols," he said, ending the debate with the flat finality of a closing blast door. "But Chaplain," he paused, and something almost like respect flickered behind his iron-masked eyes. "Your objection is noted. Formally. If I am wrong, the Inquisition will know it was raised." It was not the answer Voss wanted, but it was perhaps the only concession Thren's doctrine had room to give, and as the command staff dispersed to relay orders across 100 squads already converging on the battle-torn ash flats below, the Iron Sentinels remained a chapter divided against itself, bound by oath to a war its own chaplain believed might be a catastrophic mistake, and led by a commander who would rather be wrong and thorough than right and unprepared. Far below, on the smog-choked surface of Caldrus Secundus, none of the three newly arrived powers yet understood how close that fracture had come to changing everything. They knew only that the golden-armored warriors who had greeted them with bolter fire were now regrouping in greater numbers, and that whatever chance existed for peace was narrowing with every passing hour. If you want to see more universes collide with the 41st millennium, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a franchise you'd want to see crash into Warhammer 40K in the comments below. Sarah Kerrigan had not slept in the conventional sense for years, not since the last vestiges of her Zerg essence had woven themselves permanently into the fabric of her mind, granting her a perception that never fully switched off. But what she felt 3 hours after the Iron Sentinel's assault on the Protoss scouting line was not the absence of rest. It was the presence of something that made rest impossible. She stood alone on the Hyperion's observation deck, watching the ash-choked horizon of Caldrus Secundus churn beneath a sky the color of an old bruise, and felt it again, that same wrongness that had first brushed against her mind the moment the warp rift tore open above them. Except now it was closer. Now it had a shape. Jim. Her voice, when it came, carried none of its usual steadiness. "I need you to see something." Raynor found her a few minutes later, still staring out at nothing visible, her jaw set in the particular way it always was when she was fighting to keep something contained. "Talk to me," he said, because after everything they'd survived together, he'd learned that was usually the fastest way through her silences, not around them. "There's something out there," Kerrigan said. "Past the ridge, maybe 60 kilometers south. I felt the moment we arrived, but I thought it was just the warp, the noise, the static, all of it feeding back through whatever's left of the swarm's connection in me. I was wrong." "Wrong how?" Kerrigan turned to face him, and for just a moment, Raynor saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen since the worst days of the Second Great War. Not fear exactly, because Kerrigan didn't fear the way ordinary people did, but something colder and more clinical. Recognition. "It's not static," she said. "It's a mind, a vast one, spread across thousands of bodies, all of them screaming the same hunger into the same collective will. I know that shape, Jim. I've worn it myself." Raynor felt his stomach drop. "You're saying there's another swarm out here?" "No." Kerrigan shook her head slowly. "I'm saying there's something worse. The swarm consumes to survive, to adapt, to become more than what it was. This," she pressed 2 fingers to her temple, as though the sensation lived somewhere she could physically touch. "This doesn't want to become anything. It only wants to consume. There's no adaptation in it, no purpose beyond the next meal. It's hunger with nothing underneath it. No self. No will beyond appetite." It was, though neither of them yet had a name for it, Kerrigan's first true glimpse of the Tyranid hive mind, vast beyond even her considerable frame of reference, ancient in a way that made the Zerg swarm's few centuries of existence feel like an infant's first breath by comparison. And it terrified her precisely because it was familiar, because somewhere in that endless, silent scream of collective appetite, she recognized a shape her own mind had once worn, back when Amon's corruption had stripped away everything of her that wasn't hunger and command. "Kerrigan." Raynor's voice was careful now, the way it got when he was trying to reach her through whatever memory had its claws in her. "Talk to me. What are you seeing?" "I'm seeing what I could have become," Kerrigan said quietly. "If Amon had won, if there had been nothing left of me but the swarm's hunger and none of its purpose." She closed her eyes. "It's out there right now, Jim, whatever it is, and it already knows we exist." She wasn't wrong. 60 kilometers south, beneath the churning ash clouds of Caldrus Secundus's ruined agribelt, the splinter fleet that Chapter Master Thren had spoken of, quiet for 3 months, patient in a way that had unsettled even the Iron Sentinel's most experienced officers, had, in the span of a single afternoon, become considerably less quiet. The hive mind did not think in words, did not reason the way lesser minds reasoned, but it processed information with a speed and totality that made such distinctions meaningless. It had detected the arrival of the warp rift 3 hours prior, had catalogued the bioforms disgorged from it with the same clinical hunger it catalogued everything. And among those bioforms, it had found something it had never encountered in 10,000 years of consuming galaxies. A hive mind that was not its own, where the Tyranids processed all biomass as either food or threat, with no category in between. The presence the hive mind detected radiating from the Zerg swarm's few scattered scouting broods was something stranger, a consciousness that shared its own totalizing collective architecture. The same absence of individual will bent toward a singular purpose, and yet was unmistakably other, separate. A second hunger occupying the same conceptual space the hive mind had always assumed belonged to it alone. It did not feel threatened. The hive mind, ancient beyond any individual civilization's memory, had never needed to feel threatened by anything smaller than a galaxy. But it felt, for the first time and longer than its constituent bioforms could measure, something adjacent to curiosity. The recognition that here, at last, might be prey worth understanding before it was consumed. Bioships stirred in high orbit. Spore mines drifted lazily toward the upper atmosphere, patient as falling leaves. And somewhere in the vast, silent communion of trillions of linked minds, a decision was made that no single Tyranid organism could have articulated, but that every one of them would obey without hesitation. The splinter fleet began its descent. Aboard the Hyperion, Kerrigan felt the shift the moment it happened. A subtle change in the texture of that distant hunger, like a held breath finally released. She opened her eyes, and Raynor saw something settle over her features that he recognized immediately, because he'd seen it 100 times before on 100 different battlefields. The calm of someone who had stopped being afraid of a threat and started calculating how to survive it. "It's moving," she said. "Whatever it is, it's coming this way." "How long?" "I don't know. Hours, maybe less." Kerrigan's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Jim, I need you to understand something. Whatever this thing is, it isn't going to negotiate. It isn't going to hesitate the way the Golden Warriors did. It's not going to care whether we're Terran, Zerg, or something else entirely. To it, everything on this world is the same thing. Which is food," Kerrigan said. "And I think for the first time in my life, I understand exactly how that feels from the other side." Raynor studied her for a long moment, weighing the specific and unfamiliar weight in her voice. He had watched Kerrigan face down Zerg broods, Protoss fleets, and the corrupted will of a fallen Zelnaga without this particular note in her tone. Whatever was coming, it had reached her somewhere the rest of the galaxy's horrors hadn't. "Then we'd better figure out how to make this world a lot less appetizing," he said, and reached for the comm panel to raise our tannies. Whatever divisions existed between Dominion, Swarm, and Dalam, and whatever fury the Iron Sentinels still harbored toward all three, none of it would matter if the thing 60 kilometers south finished what it had started. Some hungers, Raynor understood, didn't care who they had to go through to eat. The Adeptus Mechanicus arrived on Caldrus Secundus not with the fury of the Iron Sentinels, but with the patient, acquisitive curiosity of a species that had long ago stopped distinguishing between war and research. Archmago's explorator Velkarn Thessis had been 3 days from the system when the first garbled reports of Xeno's incursion reached his explorator vessel, the Cogitatus Truth, and by the time he arrived in orbit above Caldrus Secundus, the chapter master's full engagement protocols had already produced exactly the kind of chaos Thessis found most professionally interesting. He did not care, particularly, about doctrine or purges. He cared about data. "Bring the sensorium arrays to full resolution," Thessis intoned. His voice a modulated rasp filtered through vocal augmetics, installed some 2 centuries prior. Half his original face remained beneath a lattice of red-robe cybernetics, and the eye that remained organic his left, had not blinked in longer than most of his servitors had been alive. I want a complete genomic and technological profile of every Xeno strain on that world before the Iron Sentinels finish exterminating whatever might have been worth understanding. His second-in-command, Muggos biologist Yelena Kret, bent over a bank of cogitator screens already flooding with preliminary telemetry. Archmagos, the Eastern bioform, the one the Astartes report as insectoid non-tyrannid. The genetic architecture is unlike anything in the Mechanicus archive. Rapid mutation rate. Modular biological weapon systems, grown rather than manufactured. If the preliminary scans are accurate, this organism can restructure its own genome in response to battlefield conditions within a single generation. Thesis's remaining organic I narrowed with something that, on a face less thoroughly augmented, might have been called hunger. The Omnisia's design principles made manifest through biology rather than technology, he murmured. Fascinating. And the second strain, the Golden Warriors. Psionic signature readings are considerable, Kret said, a note of genuine unease slipping past her clinical detachment. Whatever technology underlies their shield generation and weapon systems, it operates in tandem with a level of psychic amplification that exceeds even Eldar baseline readings from the Ectorus incident. Archmagos, if we could reverse engineer even a fraction of that integration. Do not finish that thought where the Inquisition's agents might one day extract it from your memory coils, Thesis said, though the warning carried more procedural caution than genuine reproach. But yes, I share your interest. It was, in its own bloodless way, exactly the kind of interest that made the Adeptus Mechanicus simultaneously the Imperium's most vital asset and its most quietly dangerous faction. Men and women who had long ago traded moral hesitation for the pure, consuming logic of technological acquisition, and who saw, in the arrival of 3 unknown civilizations, not a crisis to be purged, but a harvest to be gathered. Dispatch a Skitarii maniple to recover Xeno's biological and technological samples from the conflict zone, Thesis ordered. Priority on any specimens the Iron Sentinels have already neutralized. The dead do not need to be purged twice, and they make considerably more cooperative subjects. Kret hesitated. Chapter Master Thren will not welcome Mechanicus interference in his engagement zone. Chapter Master Thren, Thesis said, with the particular patience of a man who had navigated imperial politics for longer than most space marines had been alive, answers to doctrine and glory. I answer to the Omnisia. And the Omnisia is considerably more interested in what these Xenos know than in how quickly they can be made to stop existing. We will proceed with appropriate diplomatic courtesy toward the chapter master's authority. That courtesy does not require us to share his priorities. The Skitarii maniple deployed within the hour, their radium carbines and augmented senses making short, efficient work of retrieving what remained of the fallen Zerg hydralisks from the ridge above Varith Hive colony. A task made considerably easier by the fact that Zerg biomass, unlike more conventional corpses, had already begun a slow, unsettling process of post-mortem decomposition that Muggos Kret found professionally delightful and personally disturbing in roughly equal measure. It was during this recovery operation that the Mechanicus first made contact, however indirect, with the Protoss, a lone Dark Templar scout. One of Vorazan's Nerazim operating at the edge of the Dalam sensor net, observed the Skitarii maniple's careful, methodical dissection of the fallen Hydralisk corpses from a concealed vantage point half a kilometer distant. What she saw troubled her more than the earlier violence of the Iron Sentinel's assault, because violence, however brutal, was at least comprehensible. This clinical, unhurried harvesting of the dead, conducted with the same dispassionate care a xenobiologist might apply to any specimen, suggested a mind that saw the galaxy's living civilizations not as enemies or allies, but as raw material. She reported what she'd witnessed to Vorazan, who brought it before Artanis with the particular grimness of someone who had already begun cataloging every way this new galaxy could go wrong. They are gathering our dead, Vorazan said, and the dead of the Swarmkin, and likely soon our living, should the opportunity present itself. Hierarch, whatever these red-robed ones are, they do not share the Golden Warrior's doctrine of purification. They want something else from us. Knowledge, Artanis said grimly, which may prove more dangerous than mere hostility. An enemy who wishes only to destroy you can be resisted through strength. An enemy who wishes to understand and consume your strength requires a different kind of vigilance. It was a lesson the Protoss had learned once already, in their long and bloody history with the Zerg, that some threats came not as armies, but as appetite wearing the shape of curiosity. Artanis had hoped never to encounter that particular horror again outside of memory. Caldrus Secundus, it seemed, had other plans. We will not permit our fallen to become specimens for Xeno study, Artanis said. Selendes, dispatch a warp prism recovery team. Retrieve what remains of our people before the red-robed ones can claim them. Selendes' response carried the flat weight of someone who had already anticipated the order. It will be done, Hierarch, though I suspect the Golden Warriors and the red-robed ones will not appreciate the intrusion into their reclaimed territory. Then let them appreciate it as they will, Artanis said. We did not come to this galaxy seeking war, but we will not stand by while our dead are harvested like crop yields for whatever purpose these red-robed scholars intend. Above the ash-choked battlefield, the recovery operation unfolded with a strange, three-way tension that none of the participants had time to fully process. Skitarii teams working with methodical efficiency, Protoss warp prisms descending in shimmering columns to reclaim their fallen, and Iron Sentinel patrols watching both operations with a particular, simmering distrust of soldiers who had been ordered to purge everything and found the order considerably more complicated in execution than in doctrine. Archmagos Thesis, monitoring the unfolding friction from the cogitator's truth, allowed himself something almost like satisfaction. Whatever chaos the day had produced, it had also produced exactly what he valued most, data, and the promise of more to come. The Iron Sentinels could have their purge. The Mechanicus would take what could be salvaged from its wreckage. Muggos Kret, he said, watching the tactical displays fill with contested recovery zones. Prepare a formal request to Chapter Master Thren. We require access to any Xenos captured alive for the purposes of interrogation and technological analysis. He will refuse, Kret said. Then I will remind him, Thesis said, with a patient, bloodless certainty of a man who had won 1,000 quiet bureaucratic wars without ever raising a weapon, that the Adeptus Mechanicus's cooperation in maintaining his chapter's war engines is not, in fact, unconditional. Somewhere beneath the smog-dark sky of Caldrus Secundus, three civilizations that had crossed an impossible gulf between universes were beginning to learn a hard truth about the galaxy they'd fallen into. Here, even the factions nominally on the same side rarely agreed on what to do with an unknown threat, and that fracture, more than any single enemy's strength, might prove to be their only real chance at survival. Colonel Yevgen Amaro had commanded the 88th Caldrus Rifles for 6 years, long enough to watch 2/3 of her original regiment die in a war against Orc raiders that no one at Sector Command seemed inclined to reinforce. She had buried more soldiers than she cared to count in the cracked earth of this forsaken world, and she had done it all in service of an Imperium that sent her ammunition shipments late, replacement troops rarely, and orders constantly, orders that assumed resources she did not have, against enemies that did not care about Departamento Munitorum quotas. So when her forward observation post reported unknown contacts converging on the ash flat south of Verithive Colony, not Orc, not the whispered Tyrannid sightings that had haunted Sector Command's nightmares for months, but something else entirely, Marrow's first instinct was not fear. It was calculation. 3 unknown forces, her adjutant reported, breathless from the trek up from the command bunker. The Astartes are calling all of them Xenos. Full purge protocols in effect. Of course they are, Marrow muttered. She had fought alongside the Iron Sentinels for 6 years and had developed a grudging, exhausted respect for their courage and an equally deep frustration with their doctrine's complete absence of nuance. And what does Sector Command say about the Tyrannid fleet that's been sitting quiet in system for 3 months? Nothing new, Colonel. Same standing orders. Hold position, await reinforcement. Reinforcement that isn't coming, Marrow said, more to herself than to her adjutant. She had commanded long enough to recognize when a battlefield was about to become considerably worse than the report suggested, And every instinct she'd honed across 2 decades of frontier warfare told her this was one of those moments. She made her decision with the same pragmatic ruthlessness that had kept her regiment alive this long. If the Iron Sentinels wanted to burn the entire sector down chasing doctrinal purity, that was their prerogative. Colonel Merrow's prerogative was keeping as many of her soldiers breathing as possible. And if that meant approaching one of the Xenos factions directly to find out whether they represented a genuine threat or merely an inconvenient miscommunication, she'd rather ask the question herself than let the Astartes answer it with bolter fire and call the resulting body count an acceptable margin of error. Give me a channel to whatever's broadcasting on that unencrypted frequency the augurs picked up an hour ago, she told her communications officer. The one with the human voice. It took the better part of an hour for the Munitorum issue Vox equipment to establish a stable link with the Hyperion's considerably more advanced comm array, and when Jim Raynor's voice finally crackled through, rough, wary, unmistakably human, Colonel Merrow felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized was clenched. "This is Colonel Yevgeny Merrow, 88th Caldrus Rifles, Astra Militarum," she said, keeping her tone as level and procedural as she could manage. "I don't know what you are or where you came from, but my augurs confirm you're broadcasting in a human dialect, and my scouts confirm your soldiers bleed red same as mine. I'd like to understand why that isn't stopping half my sector's Astartes garrison from trying to kill you." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Merrow wondered if the channel had dropped. Then, "This is Jim Raynor, Terran Dominion. Colonel, I got about as many good answers to that question as you do. We didn't ask to fall out of the sky into your war. Neither did the Tyranids 3 months back," Merrow said dryly. "And they're still out there, sitting in system, waiting for something. You wouldn't happen to know what that something might be, would you?" Another pause, shorter this time. "We might have some idea," Raynor said. "And I promise you, Colonel, that's a conversation you want to have with us instead of shooting at us." It was, Merrow reflected, either the single most dangerous gamble of her career or the only sane decision left available to her, trusting an unknown Xenos adjacent power over her own chapter's leadership, on the strength of a hunch and a shared, human voice crackling over an improvised channel. But she had not survived 6 years on this dying frontier by clinging to doctrine when doctrine stopped producing results. "All right, Raynor," she said. "Here's my offer, for whatever it's worth from a colonel who doesn't have the authority to make it stick with sector command. My regiment holds the southern approach to Vareth Hive Colony. We've got artillery, we've got dug-in positions, and we've got 6 years of experience fighting this Ashel's particular brand of misery. If there's something worse than the Iron Sentinels' paranoia coming for both of us, I'd rather face it with allies than pretend my orders make sense." "That's a hell of an offer to extend to someone your own chain of command's already ordered purged," Raynor said. "My chain of command isn't the one that's going to bleed out on this ridge when the Tyranid fleet finally decides to stop waiting," Merrow said flatly. "I am. So's my regiment. I'd like to know what you know, Raynor, and I'd like your soldiers not shooting mine while we figure out how bad this is about to get." There was a long silence, and Merrow found herself gripping the edge of her command console harder than she'd intended, waiting for an answer from a voice she'd known for less than 10 minutes, representing a civilization she couldn't have named an hour ago. "All right, Colonel," Raynor said finally. "Alliance of convenience. We'll share what we know about the things sitting in your system. You keep your guardsmen from adding to the body count, and we all try to survive whatever's coming next. That work for you?" "It'll have to," Merrow said. "Because if what my augurs are picking up from the southern ash flats is accurate, we don't have much time left to argue about it." She was, in this at least, entirely correct. The Tyranid splinter fleet's descent, already underway, already converting orbital patience into ground-level appetite, would reach the outskirts of Vareth Hive Colony within hours, and neither Colonel Merrow's dug-in guardsmen nor Raynor's battle-weary Dominion forces yet understood the full scale of what was converging on their position. What Merrow did understand, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a soldier who had buried too many friends to indulge in doctrinal purity, was this: the galaxy she'd sworn her life to defend had never once, in 6 years of grinding frontier war, offered her allies who kept their word without an imperial oath compelling them to. And yet here was one freely given, from a civilization with every reason to distrust her uniform. "For what it's worth, Raynor," she said, before cutting the channel. "Thank you for not shooting first." "Wish I could say the same for your chapter, Colonel," Raynor replied. "But I appreciate you being the exception." Aboard the Hyperion, Raynor closed the channel and turned to find Kerrigan watching him with an expression he'd learned, across years of partnership, to read as cautious approval. "You trust her?" Kerrigan asked. "I trust that she's got more soldiers about to die than patience left for Imperial doctrine," Raynor said. "That's usually enough to make an ally out of a stranger, in my experience." "It'll have to be," Kerrigan said, turning back toward the viewport, toward the distant, ash-choked horizon where something ancient and hungry was drawing steadily, inexorably closer. "Because whatever's coming for Vareth Hive Colony isn't going to care whose uniform anyone's wearing when it arrives." The first Tyranid organisms breached the atmosphere above Vareth Hive Colony an hour before dusk, and the sky itself seemed to curdle at their passage. Bioships trailing tendrils of pale, membranous flesh, their descent marked not by engine fire, but by a wet, organic shrieking that carried for kilometers across the ash flats. Colonel Merrow's forward observers reported the sighting with the flat, professional terror of soldiers who had heard the stories but never seen the reality. And within minutes every artillery battery, the 88th Caldress rifles, possessed, had swung to bear on the darkening horizon. Kerrigan felt it before the augurs confirmed it, that same vast, silent hunger she'd sensed hours earlier, now close enough that its edges brushed against her mind like static discharge. She stood at the Hyperion's tactical display, watching the swarm of biological contacts bloom across the screen in numbers that dwarfed anything even a full Zerg brood cluster might muster, and felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel anymore. Dread. "That's not a splinter fleet," she said quietly. "That's a feeding ground being prepared." Raynor looked up sharply. "Come again." "The swarm consumes because it needs to grow, to adapt, to become something more than it was," Kerrigan said. "This is different. This doesn't want to become anything. It just wants everything on this world reduced to biomass it can use somewhere else. There's no ambition in it, Jim. No self. Just appetite, feeding a will so large I can barely perceive the edges of it. And it's heading straight for the Hive Colony," Raynor said, already moving toward the command console, along with Merrow's guardsmen, the Iron Sentinels, and every scrap of Zerg and Protoss forces still on the ground. "Yes," Kerrigan said, "which means we don't have the luxury of choosing our battles anymore." Below, on the cracked earth of the ash flats, the first true collision between the StarCraft universe's twin hive-driven civilizations began not with strategy, but with instinct. A brood of Zerglings dispatched to screen the Dominion's southern flank caught the Hive fleet's advance scouts, swift, chitinous ripper swarms skimming low across the terrain, and reacted the only way Zerg biology knew how to react to an unfamiliar biothreat, with immediate, overwhelming aggression. The two forces met in a screeching, chittering collision that produced, within seconds, a spectacle no Imperial doctrine had ever catalogued. Two alien hive species locked in close-quarter slaughter, neither hesitating, neither retreating, both driven by evolutionary imperatives too old and too absolute to permit anything but total commitment. Zergling claws tore through Ripper swarm carapace, even as Tyranid biotoxins ate through Zerg exoskeleton. And within 90 seconds, the ash flat where the skirmish occurred was littered with the dead of two galaxies that had never known the other existed until that moment. Kerrigan felt every death on both sides, as an intrusion into her mind that she had no framework to process. The Zergling deaths registered the way they always had, a subtraction, cold and familiar. But the Tyranid deaths registered as something else entirely, a brief, flickering absence in a vast collective will that didn't seem to notice or care that a piece of itself had been severed. There was no mourning in the hive mind. There was no acknowledgement at all. The dead were simply replaced by the next wave and the next, with a patience that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with an appetite too large to be discouraged by loss. "It doesn't care," Kerrigan said, more to herself than to anyone listening. "It doesn't even notice what it's losing." "Sound like something you'd know a thing or two about," Raynor said, not unkindly, and Kerrigan didn't answer, because he wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. On the ground, Sergeant Cass and the remnants of his squad watched the two Xenos forces tear into each other from a defensible position on the ridge above Vareth Hive Colony, and felt the first genuine confusion of the entire engagement settle over his combat-hardened certainty. "They're fighting each other," he reported, disbelief plain in his voice. "The insectoid strains, they're not coordinated. They're enemies." Chaplain Voss, monitoring the same feed from a forward command post, allowed himself a grim, vindicated satisfaction. "As I suspected, Chapter Master. Whatever these Zerg creatures are, they are not allies of the Tyranid fleet. If anything, their presence may be drawing the Hive fleet's attention away from Imperial positions." Thren's response, relayed through the same Vox channel, carried none of the chaplain's cautious optimism. "Or their presence has drawn a Hive fleet toward us that would otherwise have remained dormant for months longer. I do not find comfort in learning our new enemies have also made enemies of something worse, Chaplain. I find it confirms precisely how dangerous this system has become." It was, in its way, the most honest assessment either officer had yet offered, because both were correct. The Zerg's arrival had not caused the Tyranid Hive fleet's awakening. The Splinter Fleet had been patient long before Kerrigan's forces ever fell through the warp rift, but it had undeniably given the Hive mind a reason to accelerate its timeline, drawn by the presence of a genetic rival too significant to ignore. Aboard the Hyperion, Kerrigan made a decision that cost her more than Raynor would fully understand until much later. "Pull the broods back," she said. "All of them. I'm not feeding this thing an endless supply of Zerg biomass to consume at its leisure." "That's going to leave the Hive colony's southern flank exposed," Raynor said. "I know," Kerrigan said. "But every Zergling we lose to that Hive mind is a Zergling it can potentially absorb, adapt, and turn into something that understands our tactics from the inside. I won't hand it that advantage. Not without a plan." "So what's the plan?" Kerrigan was quiet for a long moment, watching the tactical display fill with a slow, inexorable crawl of Tyranid bioforms advancing on Vareth Hive Colony from 3 directions at once. When she spoke again, her voice carried the particular, focused calm that Raynor had learned to recognize as her preparing to do something drastic. "The plan," she said, "is that I stop treating this like a battle I can win with numbers and start treating it like what it actually is. A test." She turned to face him fully. "That thing out there is the closest thing to a mirror I've ever encountered, Jim. It's everything the swarm could have become if Amon had stripped away anything that made me more than an appetite. I need to understand it before I can fight it. And the only way to understand something like that is to get close enough to listen." Raynor's expression hardened. "Kerrigan, that's not a plan. That's a death wish with extra steps." "Maybe," Kerrigan said. "Or maybe it's the only advantage we have left. Everyone else on this world, the Astartes, the Guardsmen, the Protoss, they're going to fight that Hive fleet as an enemy they don't understand. I understand hive minds, Jim, better than anyone else in this system. If there's a way to turn that understanding into a weapon, I intend to find it." Outside the viewport, the ash-choked sky over Vareth Hive Colony darkened further as more bioships descended, and somewhere beneath that gathering storm, an ancient and patient hunger continued its slow, inexorable advance. Indifferent to the Astartes who feared it, the Guardsmen who dug in against it, and the Zerg Queen who alone, among every soul on Caldra Secundus, understood exactly what it meant to be consumed by something larger than yourself and somehow survive. The whisper came to Kerrigan not as sound, but as suggestion, a thought that arrived fully formed in the space between her own mind and the vast, alien hunger she'd been straining to perceive, as though something had been waiting patiently for her to open that particular door and had simply walked through the moment she did. Asterisk, you recognize it, don't you? The shape of a will that consumes without limit. You wore that shape once yourself. Asterisk. Kerrigan went very still. She was alone in the Hyperion's meditation chamber, the small, quiet space Raynor had insisted on installing years ago for exactly the kind of psionic strain she now carried, and the voice, if it could be called a voice, when it seemed to originate as much from within her own thoughts as from outside them, carried none of the hive mind's vast, indifferent hunger. This was something else, something that wanted things, something that understood want. "Who are you?" Kerrigan said aloud, not because she expected the presence to require sound, but because saying it aloud steadied something in her that badly needed steadying. Asterisk a friend, if you'll permit the word. I've watched your kind claw your way through a dozen different hungers, Sarah Kerrigan. Infested, ascended, broken, and remade. I know what it is to consume a species and call it transformation. I know what it is to be more than the sum of your battles. And I know that what crawls toward Vareth Hive Colony tonight has something you could use. Asterisk. Kerrigan's jaw tightened. Say what you mean. Asterisk, the hive mind you sense is vast, but it is also simple. Appetite without ambition, as you yourself observed. It has no throne, no crown, no singular will that could be, redirected. But you, Sarah Kerrigan, you have commanded a hive consciousness before. You have been its queen, its voice, its purpose. Imagine what such a mind could become, properly guided. Imagine an appetite of that scale, given direction. Given you asterisk. The suggestion unfolded in her mind like a diagram, terrible in its clarity. A version of herself standing at the center of not merely the Zerg swarm, but something vastly larger, an intelligence spanning star systems, given shape and purpose by her will alone. No more scattered broods struggling to rebuild what Amon had shattered. No more uncertain alliances with a dominion that half-trusted her and a Protoss people who remembered, however diplomatically, exactly what she'd once been. Just power, absolute and total, wearing a hunger large enough to reshape a galaxy. It would have been so easy, in another version of herself, to feel the pull of that image the way a starving woman feels the pull of a feast. Kerrigan had wanted power before, had wielded it, drunk on it, lost herself in it until there had been nothing left of Sarah Kerrigan but the Queen of Blades wearing her face. She knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how seductive that particular whisper could be, which was precisely why she recognized it for what it was. You're not offering me anything, Kerrigan said. You're offering me Amon again, just wearing a different voice. The presence did not deny it immediately, and in that hesitation, Kerrigan felt something shift, not retreat, exactly, but recalibration, the sense of a predator adjusting its approach after a first strike failed to land. Asterisk, Amon wished to unmake the galaxy and remake it in his image of perfection. I wish only to see what you might become, given the freedom to want something without shame. Is that so different from what you've always wanted, Sarah Kerrigan? To matter, to be more than what the swarm made you, or what Mengsk made you, or what circumstance keeps insisting you settle for, asterisk. I know what I want, Kerrigan said, and her voice, when it came, carried a certainty that surprised even her. I want the people on that world, Terran, Protoss, even the Astartes, who'd sooner kill me than shake my hand, to survive the night. I want the swarm I command to remain something I recognize when I look at it. And I know exactly what happens to anyone who reaches for power like the kind you're describing. I've been there. I remember every second of it. And I am not going back. Asterisk, even to save them? Even knowing that the hive mind bearing down on this world could be turned, redirected, made into a weapon against every threat this galaxy will ever throw at you and the people you've chosen to protect. Asterisk. Kerrigan closed her eyes. It would have been a lie to say the offer held no appeal at all, some deep, exhausted part of her, the part that had spent years rebuilding herself from the wreckage of what Amon's corruption had made her, recognized the terrible efficiency of the solution being offered. One mind, one will, absolute control over an appetite large enough to end every war she'd ever have to fight again. But she had learned, at unbearable cost, exactly what that kind of control demanded in return. It did not stay contained. It did not remain a tool wielded by Sarah Kerrigan while leaving Sarah Kerrigan intact. Power on that scale did not serve the person wielding it. It replaced them. No, she said, and the word carried a finality that seemed to ripple outward from her, pressing back against the whisper's careful, patient pressure. I won't become a bigger monster to fight a smaller one. If that's the only path to victory here, then we find another path, or we lose. But I am not doing this again. The presence withdrew slowly, unhurried, with none of the frustration Kerrigan might have expected from a being denied what it wanted. If anything, What she felt in its departure was something closer to patience. The sense of a predator that had simply logged the failed attempt and moved on to consider other prospects, other moments, other weaknesses that might prove more receptive in time. Asterisk, as you wish, Sarah Kerrigan. The offer does not expire. Should the night grow desperate enough, I will be listening. Asterisk. And then it was gone, leaving Kerrigan alone in the small, quiet chamber, her hands trembling in a way she hadn't allowed them to since the worst days of her recovery from Amon's corruption. She sat with that tremor for a long moment, forcing her breathing to steady, before she rose and made her way back toward the bridge, where Raynor was waiting with the particular, watchful patience of a man who'd learned to notice when something had shaken her. You look like you saw a ghost, he said. Worse, Kerrigan said. I saw an option. She met his eyes, and whatever he saw in her expression seemed to answer whatever question he'd been about to ask, because he simply nodded, once, and let the matter rest. Whatever it was, Raynor said, I'm guessing you said no. I said no, Kerrigan confirmed. But I don't think that's the last time I'll be asked. Outside the viewport, the ash-choked horizon churned with the gathering weight of an approaching storm. Tyrannid bioships descending in greater numbers by the hour, iron sentinel patrols regrouping along the ridge, guardsmen digging deeper into positions that would not hold much longer against what was coming. And somewhere in the space between all of it, unseen and unfelt by anyone save the one person it had chosen to test, something ancient and patient filed away Sarah Kerrigan's refusal, and began looking, instead, toward the next mind on Caldris Secundus that desperation might make more receptive. The Kala had always been, for the Protoss, both blessing and vulnerability in equal measure, a psionic network, binding every Templar caste mind into a shared communion, so total that individual thought and collective will blurred into something neither entirely one nor the other. It had been the foundation of Protoss unity for millennia, the thing that had allowed a scattered, warring people to become a civilization capable of surviving the Zerg, the fall of ire, and the long grief of exile. It had also, Artanis reflected grimly as the first demonic intrusion registered across the network, never once been tested against anything like what this galaxy's warp had to offer. It began subtly enough that the first Templar to notice it, a young zealot named Talander serving aboard the Spear of Adden, initially dismissed the sensation as fatigue, a faint, oily wrongness threading through the Kala's usually crystalline clarity, like static bleeding into a signal that had always, before now, been perfectly clean. Hierarch, Talander reported, his voice carrying the careful uncertainty of someone reporting something he half suspected might simply be his own mind failing him. I feel something. In the Kala, a presence that does not belong. Artanis had felt it too, though he had said nothing yet, hoping against experience that it might prove to be nothing more than the psychic residue of an unfamiliar galaxy's strange energies. Talander's confirmation ended that hope. Executor Selendis, Artanis said, assemble the High Templar. I want a full diagnostic of the Kala's integrity, immediately. What the High Templar found, over the following hour of increasingly urgent investigation, was worse than anything Artanis had allowed himself to anticipate. The warp, that vast roiling ocean of psychic energy underlying all of real space in this galaxy, a phenomenon utterly unlike anything in Protoss cosmology, was not merely adjacent to the Kala's function. It was, in ways the Protoss had never needed to consider before, disturbingly compatible with it. The Kala amplified psionic connection between Templar minds. The warp amplified psychic phenomena of every kind, without discrimination, without mercy, and crucially, without any of the safeguards Protoss psionic discipline had spent millennia refining. And where there was psychic amplification in this galaxy, demons listened. Hierarch, Selendis' voice, when she returned from the diagnostic chamber, carried a controlled urgency that Artanis had rarely heard from her even in the direst battles against the Zerg. The intrusion is not random. Something is testing the Kala's structure, probing for weakness, the way a besieging force probes a fortress wall. And it is learning. Learning what precisely? How to speak our language, Selendis said grimly. Not our words, Hierarch. Our thoughts. The demon, if that is what this is, has begun to mimic the resonance patterns of Templar minds it has observed within the network. It is attempting to insert itself as a voice indistinguishable from our own. Artanis felt something cold settle in his hearts. The Protoss had faced psychic threats before: Amon's corruption, the horror of the infested, the long, slow erosion of the Dark Templars' exile from the Kala itself. But nothing in their history had prepared them for an enemy that could potentially speak with the voice of a trusted brother, while carrying poison beneath every word. "Sever all non-essential Kala connections immediately," Artanis ordered. "Templar caste only maintain minimal linkage. Enough for coordination, no more. I will not risk this thing finding a foothold among warriors who cannot yet recognize its presence for what it is." The order rippled through the Dalam fleet within minutes, Templar minds withdrawing into a guarded, minimal state of connection that felt, to warriors who had spent their entire lives in constant psychic communion, disturbingly like isolation. For the Nerazim among Artanis' forces, the Dark Templar who had spent centuries in genuine exile from Akala, forging their own void-based psionic traditions in its absence, the crisis carried a bitter, complicated irony. "You come to us now," Vorazin observed, arriving at Artanis' side with a particular, dry weariness of someone who had lived this exact lesson once already, seeking the discipline of minds that learned to function without the Kala's constant communion. "Perhaps there is wisdom the Nerazim can offer, after all." "I have never doubted the wisdom of the Nerazim, Vorazin," Artani said. "Only the necessity of the schism that created it. If there was ever a moment to prove that the Dark Templars' independence from the Kala serves the Dalam's survival, it is now." "Then set us to work," Vorazin said. "My warriors' minds carry no vulnerability to whatever contagion threatens the Kala, because we severed that connection long before this galaxy's warp existed as a concern to either of us. Let the Nerazim serve as the Dalam's shield while the Templar caste weathers this storm." It was, Artanis reflected, a bitter kind of grace, that the very fracture which had once threatened to permanently divide his people now offered their only reliable defense against a threat neither faction could have anticipated. He gave the order, and within the hour, Nerazim warriors moved to secure the Spear of Aden's most critical systems, their void-attuned minds providing a psychic buffer that the vulnerable, Kala-bound Templar caste could not offer themselves. But severing connections and deploying Nerazim countermeasures addressed only the symptom, not the source, and Artanis knew it. Somewhere within the vast roiling currents of the warp, whatever entity had begun probing the Kala structure was still out there, still patient, still learning, and Artanis harbored no illusion that a temporary defensive posture would be sufficient to keep it at bay indefinitely. Aboard the Cogitator's Truth, Archmago's Thesis had detected the psychic disturbance through instruments considerably less elegant than Protoss psionics, but no less alarmed by what they revealed. "Muggos Kret," he said, studying readouts that spiked and fluttered in patterns his augmented senses found deeply unsettling. "The Xenos psychic network is under attack. Something within the warp is attempting to breach it." Kret's response carried the careful, procedural dread of someone who understood exactly what such an attack usually implied. "Demonic incursion, Archmagos. If the Xenos psychic architecture proves as vulnerable as our own psychers' minds are to such corruption, we may be looking at the early stages of a warp-born threat considerably more dangerous than any tyrannid splinter fleet." "Agreed," Thesis said. "Relay this information to Chapter Master Thren immediately. Whatever grievances the Iron Sentinels hold against these Xenos strains, a demonic incursion targeting any psychic network in this system endangers every soul present, Astartes and Xenos alike." It was, perhaps, the first moment since the crisis began that the fractured, mutually suspicious forces scattered across Caldrus Secundus found themselves aligned by something more immediate than doctrine or distrust. The shared, universal understanding that whatever crawled loose from the warp's depths did not discriminate between imperial citizen and alien invader. It simply corrupted, patiently and without mercy, whatever mind proved weak enough to let in. And on the Spear of Aden, as Templar minds withdrew into guarded silence, and Nerazim warriors took up their unfamiliar new role as the Dalam's psychic shield, Artanis allowed himself a single, grim thought that he shared with no one, not even Vorazin, that the presence probing at the Kala's edges had felt, for one fleeting instant before the connection was severed, disturbingly familiar, as though it had already tasted something like triumph once before, against a mind not entirely unlike his own, and had not yet forgotten the flavor. Astropath Primaris Ezekiel Vance had served the Adeptus Astra Telepathica for 31 years, and in all that time, he had never once known the Astronomicon to falter. It was the one true constant of his order's existence, the great psychic lighthouse lit by the Emperor's own undying will, burning across the galaxy, so that navigators aboard 10,000 ships might chart safe passage through the warp's madness. Vance had built his entire understanding of the universe around that single, unshakable certainty, which was why, when the beacon flickered for the first time in his living memory, he nearly fell from his meditation throne in shock. "Report," Chapter Master Thren demanded. The moment Vance's astropathic distress reached the Iron Vigil Strategium, the old astropath's hollow, augmented eyes, the price every member of his order paid for the gift of the Emperor's sight, seemed to stare through Thren rather than at him, fixed on something visible only within the warp's turbulent currents. "The Astronomicon," Vance said, his voice hoarse with something between awe and terror. "It flickers, Chapter Master. Not extinguished. The Emperor's will does not fail, but disturbed, as though something in this sector generates enough psychic noise to cast a shadow across even his light." Thren's expression, iron-masked and unreadable as ever, betrayed nothing of the cold dread the report produced in him. He had commanded the Iron Sentinels through 4 decades of grinding frontier war, had faced Orc Wyax and Chaos incursions and the slow, patient horror of Tyranid splinter fleets, and in all that time he had never once considered the possibility that a battle fought on a single insignificant forged world might ripple outward far enough to touch the Emperor's own beacon. "Explain how that is possible," he said. Vance's augmented eyes flickered, processing psychic currents that no unaugmented mind could perceive. 3 separate psionic architectures, Chapter Master, each vast, each utterly alien to anything the Astra Telepathica has previously catalogued, all operating within a few hundred kilometers of one another, in direct and violent conflict. The Kala network of the Golden Warriors, the chittering, hive-bound consciousness of the insectoid strain, and beneath both, something older still, a presence I cannot fully perceive, that seems to be listening to all of it with considerable interest. "A demon," Thren said flatly. "Perhaps," Vance said, "or perhaps something the ruinous powers themselves have not yet fully claimed. I confess, Chapter Master, that in 3 decades of psychic service, I have never encountered anything I could not, eventually, categorize. This, I cannot categorize, and that frightens me more than any demon I have named and fought before." It was, Thren reflected grimly, precisely the kind of admission he had feared most since the crisis began. Not that the Xenos forces scattered across Caldrus Secundus represented a conventional invasion, which he could have met with conventional doctrine, but that their mere presence, their collision, their violent and unprecedented psionic architecture, was generating disturbances that rippled outward into the immaterium itself, far beyond anything a single forge world's garrison should ever have needed to contend with. Chaplain Voss was correct, Thren admitted, the words costing him something visible even through his iron reserve. This is no longer merely a Xenos incursion to be purged according to standard doctrine. If our engagement here generates disturbances the Astra Telepathica itself struggles to interpret, then we are no longer fighting a battle contained to this world. We are fighting something that threatens to become a wound in the warp itself. "What are your orders, Chapter Master?" Vance asked. Thren was silent for a long moment, weighing options that all felt, to a man who had built his entire career on decisive certainty, uncomfortably inadequate. "Send word to Sector Command," he said finally. "Full priority astropathic transmission. I want the Ordo Xenos, and if the Astronomicon's disturbance is as significant as you suggest, the Ordo Malleus as well, aware of what is unfolding here. This is beyond the authority of a single chapter to resolve alone. That transmission will take days to reach a relay capable of forwarding it to Terra, Chapter Master," Vance said. "Longer if the psychic disturbance in this sector interferes with astropathic clarity." "Then send it now," Thren said, "because every hour we delay is an hour this convergence has to worsen. Aboard the Hyperion, Kerrigan felt the ripple in the warp's currents the moment it occurred, not with the clarity of the Astra Telepathica's trained astropaths, but with the blunter, more visceral instinct of someone who had spent years learning to sense psychic disturbance as a kind of pressure against her own mind. She had been meditating, trying to recover from the whisper's unsettling visit hours earlier, when the pressure suddenly spiked, sharp and unmistakable. "Something just happened," she told Raynor, emerging from the meditation chamber with an unease she made no attempt to hide. "Something big. I don't know what exactly, but the noise, Jim, it just got louder. Like the whole galaxy just noticed we were here." Artanis, receiving similar reports from his own newly restricted Kala network, reached much the same conclusion from an entirely different angle. "Whatever we have brought to this world," he told Solendes, "our mere presence, 3 vast and incompatible psionic architectures, forced into proximity and conflict, appears to be generating disturbances that reach far beyond this single battlefield. We are not merely fighting a war here, Executor. We may be creating one, in ways that extend beyond anything we intended or anticipated." It was a sobering realization, shared independently and almost simultaneously by 3 factions who otherwise agreed on almost nothing, that Caldra Secundus was no longer merely a battlefield where unfamiliar armies collided, but a psychic pressure point, a place where the sheer, violent incompatibility of Kala, hive mind, and warp was beginning to strain the fabric of the immaterium itself. And in a galaxy where the warp stability was the single thread from which every civilization's survival hung, that realization carried implications far graver than any single battle's outcome. Somewhere in that widening ripple of psychic disturbance, unseen by astropath, Templar, or Zerg Queen alike, something ancient stirred with interest. The same patient, hungry presence that had whispered to Kerrigan hours before, now finding itself drawn toward a convergence of power and possibility it had not anticipated encountering in this quiet, unremarkable corner of the galaxy. Whatever plans it had been content to pursue slowly, across careful centuries of patient temptation, the sudden violence of Caldra Secundus's collision offered something considerably more valuable, an opportunity, ripe and immediate, that a being of its patience rarely encountered twice. Chapter Master Thren's transmission to Sector Command would take days to arrive, and the crisis on Caldra Secundus did not have days to wait. Whatever grim recalibration his conversation with Astropath Vance had produced, it had not changed the fundamental doctrine that governed his chapter's actions in the meantime, and doctrine, absent new orders from a higher authority, defaulted to the only certainty Thren had left: purge the threat closest at hand, and worry about the metaphysics later. That threat, in Thren's calculus, remained Sarah Kerrigan. The reports from the Astra Telepathica are clear on one point if nothing else. Thren told his assembled officers, the Strategium's tactical hololith casting cold light across faces already worn thin by a day that refused to end. The insectoid strain's leader, the one designation intercepts have identified as Kerrigan, carries a psionic signature disturbingly close in architecture to the tyrannid hive mind itself. If demonic forces are probing our sector's psychic fabric, and if this Kerrigan entity shares enough resonance with the hive mind to draw such attention, then she represents a vector of corruption we cannot afford to leave unaddressed. Chaplain Voss, still bearing the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the entire day arguing against decisions he could not ultimately prevent, offered his objection with less energy than before, though no less conviction. Chapter Master, Colonel Marrow's guardsmen report the Terran forces under this Kerrigan's command withdrew their Zerg broods rather than let the Hive fleet consume them for genetic advantage. That is not the action of an entity in league with our enemy. That is the action of an entity actively resisting it, or an entity clever enough to understand that a demonstration of restraint buys her time to pursue whatever purpose drew her to this system in the first place. Thren said, "I do not discount your instincts, Chaplain. I have listened to them all day, and more than once I have found them persuasive. But persuasion is not proof, and I will not gamble this chapter's survival, nor this sector's, on the strength of an unproven Xenos' restraint." He turned to Captain Adamant. "Assemble a strike force, full tactical squad, supported by a dreadnought detachment. I want Kerrigan located and neutralized before whatever demonic influence is probing this sector finds purchase in her mind, assuming it has not already. Adamant's assent carried none of the chaplain's hesitation. It will be done, Chapter Master. The strike force deployed within the hour, moving with the grim, practiced efficiency of Astartes, who had long ago stopped questioning orders once given, whatever private doubts individual brothers might harbor. Sergeant Cass, still nursing the memory of a Protoss blade stopped a hair's breadth from his throat and a doubt he had not fully resolved, found himself among the squads assigned to the hunt, and found, too, that the doubt had not faded with time, however much his training insisted it should have. Aboard the Hyperion, Kerrigan received the first warning of the Iron Sentinel's approach not through conventional scanners, but through the same psionic sensitivity that had alerted her to the hive mind's presence hours earlier. A sharp, focused intent, moving toward her position with unmistakable purpose. "Jim," she said, "we have a problem. The Astartes are coming for me specifically." Raynor's expression hardened. "You sure?" "I can feel the intent behind it," Kerrigan said. "This isn't a general engagement. This is a targeted strike. Whatever they've decided about me, they've decided it's worth committing significant force to settle it." "Then we're not letting that happen," Raynor said, already moving toward the tactical console. "Matt, spin up the defense grid. I want every available unit." "No," Kerrigan said, and something in her tone stopped him mid-motion. "Jim, think about what we need right now. We have a Tyranid hive fleet bearing down on this world, a demonic presence probing every psychic network in the system, and a fractured, mutually suspicious collection of factions who might, if given enough reason, actually work together against both threats. If I let this become an open battle between the Swarm and the Iron Sentinels, I confirm every fear that drove them to hunt me in the first place. I become exactly the threat they believe I am." "So what? You're just going to let them take you?" "I'm going to talk to them," Kerrigan said. "Before this becomes a fight neither of us can afford." Raynor stared at her for a long moment, and Kerrigan recognized, with a familiar and complicated fondness, the particular expression he wore when he desperately wanted to argue and knew, at the same time, that arguing wouldn't change your mind. "You do remember," he said slowly, "that these are the same soldiers who opened fire on Protoss warriors who weren't even shooting back." "I remember," Kerrigan said, "which is exactly why I need to be the one who breaks that pattern. Someone has to, Jim. It might as well be me." She met the Iron Sentinel's strike force alone, on open ground half a kilometer from the Hyperion's landing position, her hands deliberately empty, her posture carrying none of the aggressive readiness that might have been mistaken for a threat. Sergeant Cass, at the front of the advancing squad, felt the same uncomfortable hesitation return that had first surfaced when a Protoss blade spared his life, and this time it lodged deeper, because the Xenos standing before him now made no move to defend herself at all. "Kerrigan," Captain Adamant said, his voice carrying through his helmet's vox grill with the flat, doctrinal certainty of a man executing orders he had no cause to second-guess. "By order of Chapter Master Thren, you are to be neutralized as a vector of potential demonic corruption. Surrender, and your death will be swift." "I'm not going to surrender," Kerrigan said, her voice carrying clearly across the ash flat despite the wind. "But I'm also not going to fight you. There's a hive fleet descending on this world right now that doesn't care whether you're wearing Imperial Ceramite or Zerg when it finishes consuming everything on this planet. If you kill me here, you lose the only person on Caldrus Secundus who actually understands what that thing is and how it thinks. That seems like a poor trade, even by your own chapter's doctrine." Adamant's bolter did not waver, but something in his stance shifted, fractionally, at the argument's uncomfortable logic. "You expect me to believe a Xenos entity offers her knowledge freely, with no expectation of return? I expect you to believe that I'd rather all of us survive the night than die proving a point about trust," Kerrigan said. "Beyond that, Captain, I don't much care what you believe. I care whether your chapter master is willing to stop hunting the people who might actually help him survive what's coming." It was, Cass would later reflect, the strangest standoff of his considerable career. An unarmed Xenos entity, offered no quarter and asking for none, making an argument built entirely on pragmatism rather than plea, while an entire Astartes strike force stood poised to end her life and found itself, for reasons none of them could fully articulate, hesitating to do so. Captain Adamant's response, when it came, would determine far more than either of them yet understood. Not merely whether Sarah Kerrigan lived to see the dawn, but whether the fractured, mutually suspicious powers scattered across Caldrus Secundus might yet find a way to survive the convergence of horrors bearing down on them all, or whether pride, doctrine, and fear would ensure they faced it divided and alone. Captain Ferrus Adamant had killed Xenos of a dozen different strains across his service to the Iron Sentinels, and he had never once hesitated in the doing of it. Doctrine did not permit hesitation. Doctrine, as Chapter Master Thren understood it and had instilled in every officer beneath him, treated hesitation as the first symptom of corruption, the seed from which compromise and eventually heresy inevitably grew. And yet he found himself hesitating now, bolter-trained on an unarmed Xenos woman who had made no move to defend herself, offering an argument that made an uncomfortable amount of tactical sense. "Hold," Adamant said finally, the word costing him more than he cared to examine. His strike force did not lower their weapons, but neither did they fire, and in that suspended moment, Sergeant Cass felt something loosen in his chest that he recognized, with quiet unease, as relief. "I am not authorized to negotiate with Xenos," Adamant told Kerrigan, "and I will not pretend otherwise." But Chapter Master Thren should hear this argument directly, rather than filtered through a report he may dismiss as Xenos manipulation relayed by a subordinate. "You will accompany us to the Iron Vigil, unarmed, under guard, and I promise you nothing beyond the chance to make your case." "That's more than I expected," Kerrigan said. "I'll take it." It was, Raynor would later argue heatedly and at length, an almost suicidally reckless decision, walking voluntarily into the command ship of a chapter that had, mere hours earlier, ordered her execution on sight. But Kerrigan had weighed that risk against the alternative, an escalating war on a world already collapsing under the weight of a tyrannid hive fleet and a demonic presence probing every mind sensitive enough to notice it, and found the gamble, however dangerous, preferable to the certainty of mutual destruction. She did not, however, make that journey entirely alone in spirit. Aboard the Hyperion, Raynor watched the tactical feed with barely restrained fury, one hand hovering over a comm panel that would summon every gunship the Dominion had planetside the instant anything went wrong. And in orbit, receiving updates relayed through increasingly tense diplomatic channels between Dalam and Dominion forces, Artanes made a decision of his own. "Selendes," he said, "dispatch a zealot honor guard to accompany the Terran envoy's meeting with the Astartes command. Not to threaten, to witness. If Kerrigan speaks truthfully of the threat we all face, the Astartes should understand that she does not stand alone in that assessment." It was, in its way, the first genuine act of solidarity between the three StarCraft factions since their arrival on Caldrus Secundus, not born of trust exactly, but of the shared, dawning recognition that survival on this world would require cooperation none of them had anticipated needing. The meeting aboard the Iron Vigil proceeded with a tension that made the strategium feel considerably smaller than its actual dimensions. Chapter Master Thren regarded Kerrigan with the flat, assessing stare of a man cataloging threats, while Chaplain Voss watched with the cautious, hopeful attention of someone who had spent the entire day arguing for exactly this kind of dialogue and had begun to fear it would never arrive. "You have 5 minutes," Thren said, "to convince me that executing you here and now is not the wisest course available to this chapter." Kerrigan did not waste time on pleasantries. The Hive fleet descending on Vareth Hive colony isn't a splinter force testing your defenses. It's the vanguard of something considerably larger, drawn here by the psychic disturbance our arrival caused. It doesn't distinguish between your soldiers, my Zerg, the Protoss, or the civilians in that Hive colony. Everything organic on this world is potential biomass to it, and it has more patience than any of us can afford to match. "We are aware of the tyrannid threat," Thren said. "It requires no Xenos to explain it to us." "Then you're also aware," Kerrigan said, "that something else has been probing every psychic network on this world, the Protoss Kala, your own astropathic relay, and yes, my own connection to what remains of the swarm. That presence offered me power beyond anything I currently command, in exchange for embracing exactly the kind of corruption your doctrine fears most. I refused it, but I doubt it stopped looking for someone more receptive, and I'd wager considerable resources that a demon patient enough to probe this entire sector's psychic fabric has already begun testing weaker minds than mine. Thren's expression did not change, but something behind his iron-masked eyes sharpened at the specificity of a claim. You speak of this as though it were fact, not Xeno speculation. I speak of it because I've faced something similar before, Kerrigan said. A being who offered me exactly the same bargain, power without limit, purpose without conscience, and very nearly succeeded in making me into something that would have ended entire civilizations without a second thought. I know what that offer sounds like, Chapter Master. I know what it costs to refuse it. And I know that whatever is testing the sector's minds tonight will not stop until it finds someone willing to say yes. The silence that followed stretched long enough that even Captain Adamant shifted uncomfortably, waiting for his chapter master's judgment. When Thren finally spoke, his voice carried none of its earlier certainty. If what you describe is accurate, he said slowly, then this crisis extends considerably beyond a single Xeno's incursion to be purged according to standard doctrine. We face a hive fleet, a potential demonic incursion, and now the suggestion that our own personnel may be vulnerable to corruption none of us have yet detected. You face all three, Kerrigan said, whether or not you trust a word I've said. The only question that matters now is whether you'd rather face them with allies who understand what's coming or alone out of pride. Chaplain Voss stepped forward before Thren could respond, seizing the opening with the careful urgency of a man who had waited all day for exactly this moment. Chapter Master, I have argued from the beginning that this crisis required understanding before judgment. Everything Kerrigan describes aligns precisely with the Astronomican's disturbance and the Kala intrusion reported by the Xeno's vessel in orbit. I do not ask you to trust her. I ask you to recognize that the threat she describes exists whether we acknowledge it or not, and that facing it divided serves no one but whatever waits to exploit that division. Thren was silent for a long moment, weighing for decades of unbending doctrine against a night that had systematically dismantled every certainty that doctrine relied upon. When he finally spoke, it was with the particular, grinding reluctance of a man choosing the lesser of two impossible options. I will not call this an alliance, he said. The Iron Sentinels do not ally with Xenos, and I will not pretend to my chapter or my emperor that this is anything other than a temporary, tactical necessity. But I will suspend the order for your execution, Kerrigan, and I will commit this chapter's strength toward the hive fleet threatening this world, rather than toward hunting you and your kin while it consumes everything we're sworn to protect. It was not trust. It was not even respect. Not yet. But it was, Kerrigan understood, exactly the opening she'd gambled her life to create, a fracture in the absolute certainty that had governed the Iron Sentinel's response to this crisis from the very first shot fired, wide enough, perhaps, for something like cooperation to grow in the hours that remained before the Hive Fleet's advance made further hesitation impossible for anyone on Caldrus Secundus to afford. The warp storm arrived without warning at 0347 local hours, and it announced itself not with sound or light, but with the sudden, catastrophic failure of every piece of advanced technology within a 15-kilometer radius of Vareth Hive Colony. Aboard the Hyperion, Matt Horner watched half his console readouts dissolve into meaningless static in the space of a single heartbeat. We're losing primary systems, he called out, fighting controls that no longer responded to input. Shield generators are down to 40% and falling. Weapon systems are intermittent at best. Raynor felt the deck shudder beneath him as backup power struggled to compensate for failures that made no engineering sense. What the hell is happening? The warp, Kerrigan said grimly, already moving toward the observation deck, where the sky beyond the viewport had begun to churn with colors that shouldn't have existed in nature. Sickly violets and bruised purples bleeding across the horizon like an infection spreading through reality itself. It's not stable here. It never has been. And whatever's been building since we arrived, the Kala intrusion, the Astronomican's disturbance, the sheer accumulated weight of 3 incompatible psionic architectures grinding against each other. It's finally found a crack to push through. On the ground, the effect proved even more devastating. Artanis felt the Protoss shield network falter first, psionic barriers that had held against Zerg assaults and Dark Templar exile, alike suddenly flickering with an instability that made no sense according to any principle the Dalam's engineers understood. "Report," he demanded, watching tactical displays fill with cascading failures across half his deployed forces. "Hierarch, the warp storm is directly interfering with our shield matrices," a Templar engineer reported, fighting to stabilize systems that seemed determined to fail regardless of his efforts. "The psionic energy underlying our technology draws from the same fundamental substrate as the warp itself, and that substrate has become violent, unpredictable. Our shields are drawing power from a well that has begun, quite literally, to boil." Selendis' voice carried across the comm network with the particular urgency of a commander watching her forces become vulnerable in real time. "Zealot Detachment Gamma reports shield failure across the board. They are exposed on the eastern flank, precisely where the Hive Fleet's advance elements are converging." Nowhere did the storm's fury manifest more dangerously than at the Iron Sentinel's forward positions, where Chapter Master Thren watched his own chapters, considerably more conventional technology, suffer failures that defied even his hardened expectations of warp-related interference. Plasma reactors flickered. Vox communications dissolved into shrieking static. And worse, in the strategium of the Iron Vigil, Astropath Vance collapsed at his meditation throne, blood weeping from augmented eyes that had, moments before, been straining to track the very disturbance now tearing through the sector's psychic fabric. "The Astropath," a servitor began. "Get him to the Apothecarian," Thren ordered, already turning back to the tactical hololith, where every friendly contact across the ash flats blinked with the same cascading instability plaguing his own command ship. "What in the Emperor's name is happening to my chapter's equipment?" It was Chaplain Voss who offered the answer, his voice carrying the particular, grim clarity of a man who had spent decades studying precisely this kind of phenomenon in preparation for exactly this kind of crisis. "The warp does not tolerate contradiction gracefully, Chapter Master. 3 vast incompatible psionic architectures, the Kala, the hive mind, and whatever demonic presence has been testing them both, have spent the better part of a day grinding against one another in the same small stretch of real space. The immaterium beneath this world has been placed under a strain it was never meant to bear. What we are witnessing is the result, a localized warp storm, born not of some distant chaos incursion, but of the very collision we ourselves have hosted." "Then we have created this," Thren said, and for the first time since the crisis began, something like genuine dread colored his flat, iron-masked voice. "We did not create it alone," Voss said, "but our presence, and theirs, made it possible. And I fear, Chapter Master, that it will only worsen the longer this convergence of forces continues to grind against one another on the same contested ground." Across the ash flats, the effects of the storm rippled through every faction's capabilities with brutal, indiscriminate efficiency. Colonel Merrow's artillery batteries suffered targeting failures that turned precision bombardment into dangerous guesswork. Dominion gunships lost navigation systems mid-flight, forcing pilots to rely on manual instruments that hadn't been calibrated for atmospheric flight in decades. Protoss warp prisms found their teleportation matrices dangerously unstable, several suffering partial failures that stranded warriors half-materialized in agonizing limbo before emergency protocols could complete the transfer. And beneath all of it, indifferent to the chaos unraveling the technology of every civilization arrayed against it, the Tyranid Hive Fleet continued its advance, because the hive mind's biological architecture evolved across 10,000 years to survive and adapt to conditions no engineered technology could withstand, felt none of the warp storm's disruption at all. If anything, the chittering vanguard of bioforms seemed to move with renewed confidence, sensing, in whatever fashion the hive mind processed such things, that its enemies had just become considerably weaker while it remained exactly, terrifyingly, itself. Jim, Kerrigan's voice, when she found Raynor on the Hyperion's ravaged bridge, carried a grim clarity that cut through the chaos of failing systems around them. The storm isn't going to pass on its own. Not while three incompatible forces keep grinding against each other on the same ground. And the Hive fleet doesn't care about any of this. It's still coming, and now it's coming at a moment when everyone opposing it is fighting with half their strength. So what do we do? Raynor asked, forcing calm into a voice that wanted, quite reasonably, to panic. We stop treating this like three separate wars, Kerrigan said. The Astartes, the Guardsmen, us, the Protoss. We're not going to survive the next few hours fighting the Hive fleet as isolated forces while our own technology falls apart around us. We need to consolidate. Now, before the storm gets any worse, and before that Hive fleet reaches Hive colony and finds every defender on this world too broken to resist it. Outside the viewport, the warp storm's violet fury churned and deepened, and somewhere beneath its poison light, the vanguard of an ancient, patient hunger continued its unhindered advance, closing, with terrible and increasing speed, on a coalition of unlikely allies that had, until this very hour, never once considered fighting as anything other than separate, mutually suspicious powers thrown together by unwanted circumstance. There was no formal ceremony to the alliance that formed in the ash-choked dark before dawn, no treaty signed, no oath sworn, no grand declaration of unity between civilizations that, hours earlier, had been trying to kill one another. There was only necessity, blunt and undeniable, and the shared understanding that whatever grievances separated Terran, Zerg, Protoss, Astartes, and Guardsmen, none of it would matter if the Hive fleet reached Hive colony, with its defenders still fighting each other, instead of a thing actually trying to consume them all. Colonel Marrow organized the defense with the brisk, practical efficiency of a soldier who had spent 6 years learning to make impossible odds survivable. Guardsmen hold the trench lines, she said, voice crackling across a hastily improvised, multi-faction comm channel that would have been unthinkable a day earlier. Astartes, you're our hammer. Wherever the line breaks, that's where you go. Terran gunships, whatever's still flying, I want air support on the flanks. And whatever the Protoss can offer in terms of shielding, we'll take gladly, because half my equipment isn't answering to orders anymore. The Nerazim shield network remained stable, Vorazan's voice replied, cool and precise despite the chaos. Void-based psionics do not draw from the same substrate the storm has corrupted. We can extend limited protection to your forward positions, Colonel, though I make no promise it will hold against the Hive fleet's full weight. I'll take limited, Marrow said. Limited beats what we've got now, which is nothing. Kerrigan stood at the center of the defensive line, flanked by what remained of her scattered broods, and felt the approaching Hive fleet's hunger sharpen with every passing minute, the vast, silent appetite drawing closer, indifferent to the storm, indifferent to the fractured coalition, scrambling to meet it. It knows we're weaker now, she said to Raynor, who stood beside her checking the charge on a rifle that, moments ago, hadn't been working at all. The storm's given it an opening it wasn't expecting, and it's not going to waste that advantage. Then we don't give it the chance to use it, Raynor said. Whatever's left of the swarm, whatever's left of the Dominion's firepower, whatever these Astartes and Guardsmen can throw at it, we make this thing bleed for every inch it takes. Our Tannies arrived at the front alongside a phalanx of zealots, their weapons humming with the particular, hard-won stability the Nerazim's countermeasures had bought them. Hierarch, Selendi said, the eastern flank remains our weakest point. If the Hive fleet concentrates its assault there, we may not hold. Then we do not permit them to concentrate, Artani said. Sarah Kerrigan understands this enemy's nature better than any of us. I would hear her counsel before we commit our forces to a static defense that plays entirely to the Hive mind's strength in numbers. It was, perhaps, the first moment of genuine, unreserved trust extended toward Kerrigan by anyone on that battlefield who hadn't already fought beside her for years, and Kerrigan felt the weight of it even amid the gathering chaos. It doesn't think the way an army thinks, she said. It doesn't retreat, doesn't feel losses the way we do, doesn't hesitate when a tactic stops working. But it also doesn't adapt quickly to something it hasn't seen before. If we hit it with something genuinely unexpected, not just firepower, but a tactic its collective memory has no precedent for, we buy ourselves time. Maybe enough time to matter. What did you have in mind? Raynor asked. Kerrigan's expression hardened with the particular, focused calm Raynor had learned to recognize across years of impossible battles. I'm going to do something the Swarm hasn't done in this galaxy yet. I'm going to let it see exactly what I am, up close, and give it a reason to hesitate before it decides I'm simply more biomass to consume. The battle that followed would be remembered, by those few who survived it to tell the tale, as the single strangest engagement in the Iron Sentinel's long and storied history. A coalition of golden-armored Protoss warriors, ceramite-clad Astartes, dug-in Imperial Guardsmen, and the scattered, adapting broods of a Zerg swarm fighting not against each other, but shoulder to shoulder against an enemy that recognized none of them as anything but food. The Hive Fleet's vanguard struck the eastern flank first, exactly as Selendes had feared, a chittering wave of Hormagaunts and Termagants surging across the ash flat with a speed that outstripped anything the defenders' failing sensors had predicted. Guardsmen lost gunfire cut down the first ranks in a storm of lost bolts, but the wave did not slow, did not hesitate, simply climbed over its own dead and kept coming. Hold the line, Marrow bellowed, her voice hoarse with the strain of commanding a battle that had already exceeded every worst-case scenario her regiment had trained for. It was the Astartes who broke the wave's momentum, Captain Adamant leading a countercharge that tore into the Hormagaunt swarm with the brutal, efficient violence the Iron Sentinels had spent 10,000 years perfecting. Bolter fire at close range, change words opening chitin like tissue paper. Astartes' discipline holding a line that lesser soldiers would have broken. But even Astartes' strength had limits, and the sheer, endless volume of the Hive Fleet's advance began slowly to grind that discipline down. It was Kerrigan who changed the battle's shape entirely. She moved to the front of the eastern flank, unshielded, exposed in a way that made Raynor's blood run cold, and did something no one on that battlefield, not Astartes, not Guardsmen, not even her own Zerg broods, had ever witnessed before. She opened herself, fully and deliberately, to the psychic pressure of the hive mind's collective will, letting it perceive her not as scattered biomass to be consumed, but as something it had never encountered, a mind that mirrored its own hive-bound architecture, and yet remained unmistakably individual. Sovereign, a queen rather than a hunger. The effect rippled through the advancing Tyranid ranks, like a stone dropped into still water. For one suspended, impossible moment, the Hive Fleet's vanguard slowed, not from injury, not from tactical calculation, but from something closer to confusion, the vast collective will processing, for the first time in 10,000 years of consuming galaxies, a consciousness it could not immediately categorize as either prey or kin. Now, Kerrigan shouted, and the coalition's combined firepower tore into the momentarily hesitant ranks with everything they had left. It was not victory. The Hive Fleet's vanguard, however briefly staggered, was still vast, still hungry, still advancing with numbers that dwarfed the defenders' remaining strength. But it was, for the first time since the crisis began, something the fractured coalition on Caldrus Secundus had not yet dared to hope for, a line that held, an enemy that hesitated, and a fragile, unlikely alliance that had, in the space of a single desperate night, found a way to fight together rather than fall separately. Dawn broke over Caldrus Secundus not with light, but with silence, the strange, hollow quiet that follows any battlefield large enough to exhaust even its survivors' capacity for fear. The warp storm had begun to dissipate in the small hours before sunrise, its violet fury bleeding back into whatever depths of the immaterium had spawned it, and with its passing, the failing technology of three civilizations slowly, haltingly, came back online. The Hive Fleet did not withdraw so much as it simply stopped. Whatever had passed between Kerrigan and the vast alien will of the hive mind in that suspended, impossible moment on the eastern flank, it had bought the coalition more than a tactical hesitation. It had bought a reassessment. The hive mind, ancient and patient beyond any single battle's outcome, had encountered something it could not immediately categorize. And rather than continue feeding an appetite into an engagement that no longer promised easy consumption, it chose, with the same cold, indifferent calculation that governed everything it did, to withdraw its remaining bioforms back toward orbit. It would return. Everyone who had fought that night understood this with grim certainty. But not today, and not against a coalition that had, however briefly, learned to fight as one. Sarah Kerrigan stood at the center of the ash flat as the sun rose, surrounded by the wreckage of a battle that had cost every faction present more than any of them had been prepared to lose, and felt, for the first time since the whisper had come to her in the quiet of the Hyperion's meditation chamber, something she recognized as a fragile, hard-won peace with herself. She had been offered the chance to become something vast and terrible, a queen of an appetite large enough to reshape a galaxy. And she had refused it, not because the offer held no temptation, but because she had finally, fully understood the difference between power that served her purpose and power that would have replaced it. In the end, it had not been overwhelming force that turned the Hive Fleet's advance. It had been her insistence on remaining stubbornly and completely herself. Chapter Master Thren found her there as the last of the smoke cleared, his chapter's losses heavy but survivable, his doctrine forever complicated by a night that had demanded compromises no amount of training could have prepared him for. "We have not become allies, Kerrigan," he said, and there was no warmth in the words, only the flat, exhausted honesty of a man reassessing certainties that had governed his entire career. "I will not pretend otherwise, to you or to my chapter, but I acknowledge what occurred here, your restraint, your counsel, the role your forces played in holding a line that would otherwise have broken. I don't need you to call it friendship," Kerrigan said. "I need you to understand that whatever comes next, the Hive Fleet's return, whatever that whisper in the warp is still planning, whatever this galaxy throws at all of us, surviving it is going to take more than doctrine alone can offer. That's the only thing I'm asking you to remember." Thren did not answer immediately, and when he did, his response carried the particular weight of a man who understood, however reluctantly, that his galaxy had just been permanently, irrevocably changed. "I will remember," he said, "and I will report to my superiors exactly what I witnessed here, doctrine and inconvenient truth alike. What they choose to do with that report is beyond my authority to determine." Artanis, arriving alongside Solendis and a battered honor guard of zealots, who had fought and bled beside soldiers from 3 different civilizations in a single desperate night, offered his own quiet reflection to Kerrigan as the ash flats wreckage smoldered around them. "We came to this galaxy through no design of our own," he said, "and found within it horrors that dwarfed even our darkest history. And yet, Sarah Kerrigan, I find myself grateful in some small measure for what this night revealed, that even scattered across an impossible gulf between universes, thrown among strangers who had every reason to fear us, we could still choose to stand together rather than fall apart." "Don't get used to it," Kerrigan said, though something in her voice suggested she meant the words less harshly than they sounded. "This galaxy doesn't seem inclined to make peace easy." "No," Artanis agreed. "But perhaps that only makes the choosing more meaningful." Jim Raynor found Kerrigan alone at the ash flat's edge as the coalition survivors began the grim work of counting their dead and rebuilding what could be salvaged before nightfall brought new dangers. He said nothing at first, simply stood beside her, watching the same horizon she watched, until the silence between them settled into something companionable rather than heavy. "We're a long way from home," he said finally. "We were a long way from home before any of this started," Kerrigan said. "I think that's just going to be true for a while yet." "Yeah," Raynor said. "Guess we'd better get used to it." Far above them, in orbit around a world that had, in the span of a single impossible day, become the first battlefield in what all 3 factions understood would be a much longer war, the warp continued its ceaseless, indifferent churn, carrying within its currents not only the retreating vanguard of an ancient hunger, but the patient, watchful presence of something that had tasted, however briefly, the promise of Sarah Kerrigan's power and had not forgotten the flavor of that temptation. The 42nd millennium had never known a galaxy that contained the Terran Dominion, the Zerg Swarm, or the Protoss Dalam. It did now, and whatever grim, uncertain future awaited a coalition forged not from trust, but from necessity. One truth had already been written into the ash of Caldrus Secundus, plain for any who cared to read it. The grim darkness of the far future had just gained 3 new players, and none of them, not the Imperium, not Chaos, not even the ancient, patient hunger of the hive mind itself, would ever again be able to pretend the galaxy was as small or as simple as it had been before. Against all odds, the Swarm, the Dominion, and the Dalam had carved out a foothold in a galaxy that devoured the weak, forging in a single desperate night something no doctrine, no prophecy, and no ancient hunger had anticipated. An alliance built not on shared belief, but on the hard, unglamorous recognition that survival sometimes demands standing beside those you do not yet trust. For Sarah Kerrigan, the Battle of Caldris Secundus marked something more personal than a mere military engagement. She had been offered, in the space of one night, the clearest temptation of her long and complicated history, the chance to become something vast and absolute, an appetite given crown and purpose, exactly the kind of power that had once stripped away everything of her that wasn't hunger and command. She had refused it, not from certainty that the choice was easy, but from hard-won knowledge of exactly what such power cost the person who wielded it. In choosing to remain herself, flawed and finite, rather than become something limitless and empty, Kerrigan had won a victory that mattered more than any battlefield. For Jim Raynor, the night offered a familiar, weary confirmation of a truth he had learned across years, fighting beside Kerrigan through worse odds than even this, that the galaxy, whichever one they found themselves in, would always test the people willing to stand against its worst horrors, and that the only real defense against being consumed by that darkness was choosing, again and again, not to become it. For our Tannis and the Dalam, Caldris Secundus offered a bitter but valuable lesson in humility. The Protoss had come to this galaxy carrying the accumulated wisdom of their long history with the Zerg, their exile, their slow rebuilding, and had found in the crucible of a single desperate battle that even ancient wisdom required adaptation when confronted with threats no history could have prepared them for. The reconciliation between Templar and Narism, however temporary, however born of necessity rather than genuine reunion, hinted at possibilities the Dalam had not permitted themselves to consider before this crisis forced the question. And for the Imperium of Man, for Chapter Master Thren, for Chaplain Voss, for Colonel Marrow, and the exhausted, battle-worn soldiers of the 88th Caldris Rifles, the night raised questions that doctrine alone could no longer answer. What did it mean to defend humanity against every threat imaginable, when some of those threats arrived not as invaders, but as strangers capable of standing beside you against something worse? Thren's report to Sector Command would carry uncomfortable truths that Imperial orthodoxy rarely tolerated well, and the Inquisition's eventual response to a chapter master who had, however briefly, suspended a Xenos execution order in favor of tactical necessity remained an open and dangerous question. But beneath all of it, the fragile coalition, the temporary truce, the uneasy respect earned through shared blood and shared loss, lurked the patient, unresolved presence of something ancient that had tested Kerrigan's resolve once and had not, by any measure the survivors of that night could determine, abandoned its interest in trying again. The Hive Fleet's retreat bought time, not victory. The Demon's silence bought caution, not safety. And the warp itself, however calmed by the storm's passing, remained a wound that Caldris Secundus's collision of civilizations had opened, and that some future crisis would surely test again. Whether the coalition forged in that single desperate night would hold, fracture, or transform into something the galaxy had never seen before remained, as dawn gave way to the long work of rebuilding, a question no one on Caldris Secundus could yet answer with certainty. What they knew, each in their own hard-won way, was this: the 42nd millennium had changed irrevocably, the moment three strangers from beyond the stars chose to stand together rather than fall apart. And in a galaxy built on eternal, grinding war, that choice, however small, however fragile, was its own kind of victory. For Ire, for the Swarm, for the Dominion, the Emperor protects, for now.